The morning mist clung to the pine boughs like ghostly fingers when Ezra Hawkins first saw the smoke rising from the valley below. He'd been living alone on Eagle's Peak for nigh on 7 years, trading pelts and keeping to himself, content with the company of his old mule Jeremiah and the whisper of wind through the aspens. But smoke meant people, and people meant trouble in these parts, where the Apaches still roamed and settlers pushed ever westward into lands that weren't meant for them. Ezra pulled his worn leather coat tighter against the October chill and squinted through the scope of his rifle. Down in the valley, where the McBride homestead sat like a brown speck against the golden grass, orange flames licked at what remained of the barn. The house itself looked intact from this distance, but something was wrong. The smoke was too thin, too scattered, like a fire that had already done its worst and was dying down to embers. He'd known Tom McBride for 3 years, ever since the man had brought his young wife Sarah out from Missouri to try farming in this unforgiving country. Ezra had warned them about settling so close to Apache hunting grounds, but Tom was stubborn as a Missouri mule and twice as ornery. Sarah, barely 20 with hair like spun gold and eyes the color of summer sky, had been kind to the old mountain man, always offering him coffee and cornbread when he came down to trade. Now, as Ezra made his way down the treacherous mountain path, his boots slipping on loose shale and his heart hammering against his ribs, he feared the worst. The Apache had been restless lately, pushed harder by the cavalry and growing desperate as their traditional hunting grounds shrank. Captain Morrison at Fort Sage had been recruiting every able-bodied man to join his patrols, but Ezra wanted no part in the Army's brutal tactics. He'd seen enough killing in the war back east to last him several lifetimes. The smell hit him first when he reached the valley floor: smoke, burned wood, and something else that made his stomach turn. He approached the homestead with his rifle ready, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The barn was a blackened skeleton against the sky, and the cornfield had been trampled flat. Chickens lay scattered in the yard, their necks wrung, and Tom's prize bull had been butchered where it stood. But it was the silence that unnerved him most. No crying, no moaning, no sound at all except the crackle of dying embers and the buzz of flies already gathering in the autumn heat. Ezra called out as he approached the house, his voice cracking from disuse and fear. "Tom, Sarah! You folks all right in there?" The words echoed off the mountains and died away, leaving only the whisper of wind through the burned timbers. That's when he saw her. Sarah McBride hung from the roof beam of the front porch, her blonde hair catching the late morning sun like a hollow, but there was nothing angelic about the scene before him. Her dress was torn, her feet bare and scratched from struggling, and across her forehead, burned deep into the pale skin with what looked like a hot iron, were the words, "Apache Lover," in crude, angry letters. The rope around her neck was tight, her face purple from strangulation, but her chest was still rising and falling in shallow, desperate gasps. Ezra dropped his rifle and ran to her, his hands shaking as he cut the rope with his hunting knife. She fell into his arms like a broken doll, and for a terrible moment he thought she was too late. But then she stirred, drawing in a ragged breath that sounded like salvation itself, and her blue eyes fluttered open to stare at him with a mixture of recognition and terror. "Sarah," he whispered, carrying her into the house and laying her gently on the bed she'd shared with Tom. "Sarah, who did this to you? Where's Tom?" She couldn't speak at first, her throat too damaged from the rope, but she pointed toward the kitchen with a trembling finger. Ezra found Tom there, face down in a pool of blood that had already begun to congeal in the morning heat. 3 bullet holes decorated his back, neat and precise, the work of men who knew how to kill efficiently. The house had been ransacked, furniture overturned, and Sarah's precious china teacups lay shattered on the floor like broken dreams. But this wasn't the work of Apache raiders. Ezra had seen their handiwork before, and they didn't leave calling cards burned into white women's flesh. This was something else, something that spoke of a hatred more personal and more deadly than simple warfare between races. When he returned to Sarah's side, she was trying to sit up, her hand pressed to her forehead where the letters stood out like a brand of shame. The skin around the burns was already blistering, and he could see that whoever had done this had taken their time, making sure the message would be permanent. "They came at dawn," she whispered, her voice barely audible through her damaged throat. 6 men, maybe 7. Said they were hunting Apache, but they knew. She broke down then, sobbing into her hands, her whole body shaking with the memory of what had been done to her. Ezra knelt beside the bed, his weathered face grim as winter stone. He'd seen enough of man's capacity for cruelty during the war, but this felt different, more personal. Who were they, Sarah? Did you recognize any of them? She shook her head slowly, wincing at the movement. Strangers. But they knew about Joseph. They knew about my baby. The words hit Ezra like a physical blow to the chest. He'd suspected for months that Sarah's frequent trips to gather herbs and berries were taking her farther from home than necessary, and that the sadness in her eyes had nothing to do with the hard life of frontier farming. He'd seen the way she would disappear for days at a time, telling Tom she was visiting her sister in Kansas City, but always returning with a haunted look that spoke of secrets too dangerous to share. "Where is the child now?" he asked gently, though his heart was already sinking with the knowledge of what her answer might mean. "Hidden," she said, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks. "In the old mine shaft, where Tom used to store tools before winter set in. I built a shelter there, brought supplies whenever I could. Joseph, his father, was Apache, a warrior named Standing Bear who was wounded in a skirmish last winter. I found him by the creek, half dead from cold and blood loss. I couldn't just let him die, Ezra. I couldn't watch a man bleed to death in the snow, no matter what color his skin was." Ezra closed his eyes, understanding flooding through him like ice water in his veins. In this territory in these times, showing mercy to an Apache warrior was tantamount to treason in the eyes of most white settlers, and bearing his child was an unforgivable sin that could get a woman killed by her own people. But Sarah had never been like other settler women. She had a heart too big for the narrow confines of frontier prejudice, and now she was paying the price for her compassion. "How old is the boy?" he asked. 6 months. He has his father's eyes dark as midnight, but my hair and my smile. I've been caring for him in secret, telling Tom I was tending to a sick relative whenever I needed to stay with Joseph for more than a day or two." Her voice broke again, the guilt and grief pouring out of her like blood from a wound. "Tom never knew. He died thinking I was faithful to him, thinking the trips to Kansas City were real. I let him die believing a lie." The guilt in her voice cut through Ezra's heart like a rusty blade. Here was a woman who had shown compassion to a dying enemy, who had loved without regard for the consequences, and now she was paying a price no human being should have to pay. The men who had done this to her weren't soldiers or lawmen defending their territory. They were vigilantes, the kind of men who took the law into their own hands and twisted it to serve their own hatred and fear. "The child," Ezra said urgently. "If they knew about him, they'll be looking. We need to get to him before they do." Sarah struggled to sit up, her face pale as new snow. "The mine shaft is 1.5 miles from here, hidden in a grove of cottonwoods that Standing Bear showed me. He said his people used to hunt in those canyons long before the miners came looking for silver. But if those men are still out there, then we'd better hope we're faster than they are." Ezra helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as they moved toward the door. "Can you ride?" Sarah nodded, though she swayed like a sapling in a strong wind. "I can do whatever I have to do to save my son." They took Jeremiah and Tom's mare, riding hard toward the mine through country Ezra knew like the back of his weathered hand. The autumn air was crisp and clean, a sharp contrast to the horror they'd left behind at the homestead. As they rode, Sarah told him about Standing Bear, how he'd been different from the other Apache warriors she'd heard about in the stories that circulated through the territory. "He never hurt me," she said, her voice carried away by the wind as they galloped through the golden grass. "Even when he was healing, even when he was delirious with fever and could have done anything he wanted, he was gentle. We couldn't speak each other's language at first, but kindness needs no translation. He taught me Apache words, and I taught him English. By the time he was strong enough to rejoin his people, we had become—" She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Ezra understood. Love was love, no matter what color the skin that contained it, and Sarah had found something in Standing Bear's arms that she'd never found with her own husband. It was a dangerous love, a forbidden love, but it had been real enough to create the child they were now racing to save. The story she told as they rode was one of unexpected tenderness born in the most unlikely circumstances. Standing Bear had been leading a small raiding party against a cavalry supply train when he'd taken a bullet in the chest and another in the leg. His horse had carried him miles before collapsing from exhaustion, and he'd crawled to the creek where Sarah found him, more dead than alive. Any sensible frontier woman would have finished him off or left him to die, but Sarah had seen something in his eyes that spoke to her heart. I brought him food and medicine in secret. She continued as they rode through a stand of aspen trees that shimmered like gold coins in the afternoon sun. Tom thought I was tending to a sick calf in the far pasture. Standing Bear was suspicious at first, thought it might be some kind of trap set by the cavalry. But when fever took him and he was delirious for 3 days straight, I stayed with him, cooling his brow with creek water and making sure he didn't thrash around and reopen his wounds. The mine shaft sat in a natural depression, surrounded by scrub oak and wild berry bushes that had already begun to turn red and gold with the coming winter. Sarah had chosen the location well. The entrance was nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, hidden behind a curtain of branches and fallen logs that looked natural but had been carefully arranged. They dismounted and Sarah led him down a narrow path she'd carved through the underbrush, moving with the quiet efficiency of a woman who'd made this journey many times. Inside the mine, she'd created a small living space with blankets stolen from her own home, supplies purchased in town and carefully hidden, and toys carved from wood with the patient skill of someone who had nothing but time and love to give. And there, sleeping peacefully in a cradle made from an old ammunition crate, was the most beautiful child Ezra had ever seen. The boy had Sarah's golden hair, fine as corn silk, and her delicate features, but his skin was darker than his mother's, touched with the bronze of his father's people. His eyes, when they opened at the sound of his mother's voice, were indeed black as midnight and full of an intelligence that seemed far beyond his 6 months of life. "Joseph," Sarah whispered, lifting him from the cradle with hands that trembled with relief and fear in equal measure. "Mama's here, sweet boy. Mama's here." The child gurgled happily and reached for her face with tiny fingers, completely unaware of the danger that surrounded them. Watching them together, Ezra felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought dead and buried years ago. This woman had risked everything for love, had chosen compassion over safety, and now she was paying the price. But looking at the child in her arms, seeing the pure innocence in those dark eyes, Ezra knew that some prices were worth paying. "He's beautiful," Ezra said softly, and he meant it. The boy was a perfect blend of two peoples who had been at war for generations, living proof that love could bridge any gap if given the chance. But their reunion was cut short by the sound of horses approaching through the trees, the jingle of spurs and the creak of leather that meant armed men moving with purpose. Ezra motioned for silence and crept to the mine entrance, peering out through the carefully arranged brush. 7 riders sat their horses at the edge of the grove, and even from a distance he could see the hard set of their faces and the weapons they carried with the casual confidence of men who knew how to use them. The leader was a big man with a black beard streaked with gray and cold eyes that swept the area like a wolf searching for prey. Ezra recognized him as Jake Sullivan, a former Confederate officer who'd come west after the war with a small army of followers and a heart full of bitterness toward anyone who didn't share his particular view of how the world should be ordered. Sullivan hired himself out as a regulator, cleaning up towns and territories for whoever had the money to pay him, and his methods were as brutal as they were effective. "I know you're in there, Apache Lover," Sullivan called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls like the boom of thunder. "Come out now with that half-breed bastard and we'll make it quick. Keep hiding and I promise you'll watch him die slow while you beg for mercy that ain't coming." Sarah pressed her face against Ezra's shoulder, her whole body trembling like a leaf in a hurricane. The child seemed to sense the danger and began to fuss, but she rocked him gently, humming a low Apache lullaby that Standing Bear had taught her, somehow keeping him quiet despite her own terror. Ezra could see the fierce determination in her eyes, the look of a mother who would die before letting harm come to her child. Ezra counted his options and didn't like any of them. He had his rifle and maybe 20 rounds of ammunition in his belt. Sarah had Tom's old pistol, but she was in no condition to fight, not with a baby to protect and rope burns around her throat that made every breath a struggle. The mine had only one entrance that he could see, which meant they were trapped like rabbits in a warren. But it also meant Sullivan's men would have to come through a narrow opening to get to them. "There's another way out," Sarah whispered suddenly, her voice barely audible. "A shaft that connects to the old silver mine up the ridge. Standing Bear showed it to me when he was teaching me about the canyon. Said his people used to hunt in these mountains long before the white miners came looking for treasure that was never theirs to take." Hope flared in Ezra's chest like a struck match. "Can you find it in the dark?" "I think so. But it's narrow in places, barely wide enough for one person, and there are spots where we'll have to crawl on our bellies. With the baby. Better than staying here to be slaughtered like sheep." Ezra checked his rifle one more time, making sure the action was smooth and the barrel was clear. "I'll hold them off long enough for you to get away. There's a trading post at Bear Creek, about 10 miles north through the high country. Old Pete, who runs it, is decent folk. He'll help you get to Santa Fe or Denver, somewhere you can start over with a new name and a new life." Sarah grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "I won't leave you to die for us." "You will," Ezra said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd made his peace with death long ago. "Because that boy needs his mother more than the world needs one old mountain man who's outlived his purpose." The words came out harder than he'd intended, but they carried the weight of truth. He'd lived his life, had his chances at love and family and happiness, and thrown them all away for the bottle and the war and the guilt that ate at him like acid in his veins. But Sarah and her child still had a future ahead of them, if he could buy them enough time to escape into it. Before Sarah could argue further, Sullivan's voice boomed out again, closer now, filled with the kind of casual cruelty that Ezra had heard too many times in too many wars. "Last chance, woman. We know you're in there with that breed child. Come out now with your hands up, or we're coming and shooting, and I guarantee you won't like what happens after we're done with the boy." Ezra kissed Sarah's forehead gently, the way he might have kissed the daughter he'd never had, the family he'd never been brave enough to build. "Go now. Take the back tunnel and don't look back, no matter what you hear. Promise me." With tears streaming down her face, Sarah gathered Joseph and the few supplies she could carry. She paused at the entrance to the rear tunnel, looking back at the old man who was preparing to give his life for hers, searching for words that could somehow express what his sacrifice meant. "Why?" she whispered. "Why are you doing this for us?" Ezra smiled, and for a moment the years seemed to fall away from his weathered face, revealing the young soldier he'd once been before the war had carved the kindness out of him and left only scar tissue behind. "Because someone has to stand between the wolves and the innocent, Sarah. Someone has to say not today to the darkness that wants to swallow up everything good in this world." She disappeared into the tunnel just as the first shots rang out, bullets ricocheting off the mine walls and filling the air with the deadly whine of lead and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Ezra took position behind a pile of old ore carts and returned fire, his shots carefully placed to make Sullivan's men think twice about rushing the entrance. He could hear them shouting to each other, planning their assault with the methodical precision of men who'd done this kind of killing before. But every minute he bought was a minute for Sarah and Joseph to get farther away, deeper into the mountain where Sullivan's hatred couldn't reach them. He thought about the life he'd chosen, the solitude he'd embraced after the war had finished chewing him up and spitting him out, and realized that in all his years on the mountain, he'd never felt more purposeful than he did in this moment. A shadow moved at the mine entrance and Ezra fired, hearing a cry of pain as one of Sullivan's men stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder. But they were getting bolder, more desperate, probing the entrance like wolves testing the defenses of a sheepfold. Soon they would rush him en masse, and then it would be down to his knife and whatever strength remained in his aging body. That's when he heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold and filled his heart with hope at the same time. War cries echoing off the canyon walls, the thunder of unshod horses moving at full gallop, and the whistle of arrows cutting through the air with deadly precision. The Apache had arrived, and they hadn't come to parley. Sullivan's men found themselves caught between two enemies, and their discipline broke like a dam under the pressure of flood water. Some tried to mount their horses and flee toward open ground. Others sought cover behind rocks and trees, but the Apache warriors moved like shadows given deadly form, striking hard and disappearing before return fire could find them. Through the chaos and gun smoke, Ezra saw Standing Bear himself, magnificent on his painted war horse, his face streaked with ceremonial paint, and his eyes burning with the fury of a father come to protect his family. This was no random raid or coincidental encounter. This was a warrior who had somehow learned that his woman and child were in danger, and had come with his brothers to exact the kind of justice that white man's law would never provide. The battle was brief and brutal. decided not by superior numbers or better weapons, but by the righteous fury of men fighting for something more precious than their own lives. Sullivan's superior firepower meant nothing in close quarters against warriors who had been fighting for their homeland since they were old enough to hold a lance, who knew every rock and tree and hiding place in these mountains. When the shooting stopped and the last echo died away among the canyon walls, only 2 of the vigilantes were still alive, and they were wounded and begging for mercy they had never shown to others. Sullivan himself lay face down in the dirt, 3 Apache arrows decorating his back like the wings of some dark angel. Standing Bear dismounted and approached the mine entrance, speaking in rapid Apache to his warriors who melted back into the forest like smoke. The 2 men regarded each other across a gulf of race and culture, but united by their love for the woman and child who had brought them together in this unlikely alliance. "You fought for my woman and my son," Standing Bear said in careful English, each word precisely chosen. "This makes you brother to Standing Bear, brother to all the people." Ezra nodded respectfully, recognizing the formal nature of what was being offered. "Sarah and Joseph are safe. I sent them through the back tunnel toward the old silver mine." Standing Bear's stern expression softened slightly, the war paint unable to hide the relief in his dark eyes. "You are wise, old warrior. But they cannot go to the white man's places now. There will be more like these." He gestured toward the bodies scattered around the grove. "And they will never stop hunting until they have spilled the blood they came to spill." "Then what do you suggest?" Ezra asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Standing Bear was quiet for a long moment, gazing toward the sacred mountains that had been his people's home since the world was young. "There is a place," he said finally, "high in the mountains where the spirits dwell, where my people go when the world below becomes too dangerous for those we love. A hidden valley where the old ways still live, where a child can grow up free from the hatred of both our peoples. And Sarah, she's white. Will your people accept her as one of their own?" Standing Bear's smile was sad but genuine. "She saved the life of a warrior when she could have let him die. She bore a son of the people when it would have been safer to refuse his father's love. In the old traditions, this makes her Apache in all the ways that matter, regardless of the color of her skin." He mounted his horse again, sitting straight and proud despite the wariness in his eyes. "Will you come with us, old warrior? Or will you return to your mountain to live alone with your ghosts?" Ezra looked around at the scene of carnage, at the life he'd built in isolation, at the choice that lay before him like a fork in a mountain trail. He could go back to Eagle's Peak, back to the solitude and safety he'd known for 7 years, back to the slow death of a man who had given up on finding meaning in his remaining time on Earth. Or he could follow this path wherever it led, into a world he'd never imagined, with people who had somehow found room in their hearts for an old soldier who'd lost his way. "I'll come," he said simply. "Someone needs to teach that boy how to shoot straight, and I reckon I'm the best man for the job." They found Sarah and Joseph at a creek crossing 2 miles deeper into the mountains, where she'd stopped to rest and tend to her wounds in the shelter of a natural rock overhang. When she saw Standing Bear alive and whole, riding toward her like something out of a dream, the relief in her face was like sunrise after the longest night in memory. The warrior dismounted and approached slowly, speaking to her in the Apache tongue with a voice gentle as summer rain on drought, stricken ground. She answered in the same language, and Ezra realized she'd learned far more during those secret months than just how to care for a wounded man. When Standing Bear took his son in his arms for the first time, the child gazed up at him with those dark eyes and seemed to recognize something familiar, something that belonged to him by blood and bone and spirit. "He's beautiful," Standing Bear said in English for Ezra's benefit. "Strong like his mother, wise like his grandfather's people." "Grandfather?" Sarah looked confused, though hope was beginning to dawn in her eyes. Standing Bear smiled, and for the first time since Ezra had known him, the Apache warrior looked young despite the premature lines that warfare and responsibility had carved into his face. In Apache custom, the one who saves a child's life becomes grandfather to that child bound by ties stronger than blood alone. Ezra Hawkins is now family, if he chooses to accept this honor. Ezra felt tears he hadn't shed in decades gathering in his eyes like storm clouds on the horizon. Family. After all these years of running from human connection, of hiding from the responsibilities and joys and sorrows that came with loving other people, He'd found it in the most unlikely place with the most unlikely people. The journey to the hidden valley took 3 days of hard traveling, winding through passes Ezra never knew existed, and along trails that seemed to vanish behind them as they traveled, as if the mountains themselves were conspiring to keep their destination secret. Standing Bear's band was small, maybe 20 warriors and their families, but they moved with the fluid confidence of people who knew every rock and tree and water source in their domain. The valley, when they finally reached it through a canyon so narrow that the horses had to walk single file, was everything Standing Bear had promised and more. Hidden behind towering cliffs that reached toward the sky like the walls of some natural cathedral, it held meadows green as emeralds, clear streams full of trout, and enough game to support the small community that called this place home. The Apache here were different from the warriors Ezra had encountered in his years on the frontier. Older, wiser, keepers of traditions that stretched back to the very beginning of time. Sarah was welcomed with ceremonies that honored her courage and her status as mother to one of the people, rituals that spoke of acceptance and belonging in ways that transcended the barriers of race and culture. Joseph was blessed by the medicine man with sacred smoke and ancient words, and given an Apache name that meant bridge between worlds, a child who would carry the best of both peoples into whatever future awaited them all. And Ezra found himself adopted into a culture he'd spent years fearing, discovering that the Apache concept of honor and family wasn't so different from the values his own father had tried to teach him back in Tennessee before the world had gone mad with war and hatred. Winter came early that year, sealing the valley behind walls of snow and ice that would keep it hidden from the outside world until spring returned to melt the barriers away. Ezra built a cabin near Sarah's lodge, close enough to help with Joseph when needed but far enough to give the new family the privacy they deserved. He taught Standing Bear to read and write English, sharing the knowledge that might someday help his people navigate the changing world beyond the mountains. In return, the warrior shared the secrets of tracking and survival that his people had perfected over countless generations, skills that made Ezra feel more alive than he had in years. Sarah flourished in the valley like a flower finally planted in fertile soil. Her wounds healed, both the physical burns on her forehead and the deeper scars in her heart, and her spirit returned as she found acceptance among women who judged her not by her past mistakes but by her present courage. Joseph grew strong and healthy, learning to walk on legs that would carry him between two worlds, speaking the languages of both his parents with equal fluency and promise. On quiet evenings, when the wind whispered through the pines, and the stars blazed overhead with a clarity impossible in the outside world, Ezra would sit by his fire and think about the strange path that had led him to this place. He'd come to the frontier seeking solitude, running from the connections and responsibilities that had brought him so much pain during those terrible years, when brother fought brother, and the nation bled itself nearly to death. But in trying to save others, he'd somehow managed to save himself. One night in late spring, as the valley began to shake off winter's grip and wildflowers started to paint the meadows in brilliant colors, Sarah visited him with Joseph toddling at her side. The boy had grown into a sturdy child with his mother's quick smile and his father's steady gaze, equally comfortable with Apache games and white man's stories, a living bridge between worlds that had been at war for far too long. "I wanted to thank you," Sarah said, settling beside Ezra's fire while Joseph played with wooden horses that Standing Bear had carved for him with infinite patience. "Not just for saving our lives that day, but for giving us a future I never could have imagined when those men came to destroy everything I loved." Ezra smiled, watching the child who had become as dear to him as if he'd been born from his own blood. "I think you saved me more than I saved you, Sarah. I was dying up on that mountain, just didn't know it yet, dying slow and lonely, like a man who'd forgotten what it meant to be part of something bigger than his own small sorrows. What will you do when Joseph is older? When he doesn't need a grandfather watching over him every day?" Ezra considered the question, gazing out at the valley that had become more home to him than any place he'd ever lived. "I reckon I'll be right here, teaching his children to shoot straight and telling them stories about the crazy old mountain man who stumbled into their family by accident and stayed because he finally figured out where he belonged." Sarah laughed, and the sound carried across the valley like music from some better world where love conquered hatred and understanding built bridges over the chasms that divided people. "I don't think it was accident, Ezra. I think it was something much more powerful than chance or coincidence. As if to prove her point, Joseph abandoned his wooden horses and tottered over to climb into Ezra's lap, chattering in the mixture of Apache and English that had become his natural language, a combination that only the three adults who loved him most could fully understand. The old mountain man held the child close, marveling at how such a small life could carry so much hope, so much possibility for healing the ancient wounds that had divided people for far too long. Years would pass, and the world beyond the valley would continue to change. White settlers and Apache warriors would eventually find ways to coexist, if not in perfect harmony, then at least without the constant threat of violence that had once defined their relationship. The hidden valley would no longer be necessary as a refuge from hatred and fear, and some of its inhabitants would venture back into the wider world to help build bridges between peoples who had forgotten how to talk to each other. But Ezra would remember this moment as the one when he finally understood what he'd been searching for all his life. Not solitude, not escape from human pain and complication, but family. Messy, complicated, beautiful family that transcended race and tradition and all the narrow definitions the outside world wanted to impose on love and belonging. The boy in his arms would grow up to be exactly what his name promised, a bridge between worlds, carrying his grandfather's stories and his parents' courage into a future where the color of a person's skin would matter less than the content of their character and the strength of their heart. And somewhere in those stories, passed down through generations yet to come, would be the tale of a lonely mountain man who found something worth living for in a moment of desperate heroism, and learned that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the one you're born into. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, indifferent to human struggles and triumphs alike, but in a hidden valley where two peoples had learned to become one family, hope lived on in the laughter of a child who belonged to all worlds and would spend his life helping to heal them all.